The humid Nashville air hung heavy as the evening rush hour began to wind down in the downtown district. The fluorescent lights of the Music City metro station flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows across the concrete platform. Among the scattered commuters waiting for the next train, a weathered figure sat on a small folding stool near the edge of the platform, his calloused fingers moving deliberately across the worn strings of an acoustic guitar. James Richardson adjusted his prosthetic leg beneath him, wincing slightly as he found a comfortable position. The 55-year-old veteran had made this spot his own over the past 8 months, ever since his disability benefits had been cut, and his part-time job at the hardware store had been eliminated due to budget constraints. The guitar case lay open before him, containing a modest collection of crumpled bills and loose change, barely enough to cover his daily meals, let alone the mounting medical bills that seemed to multiply like weeds after rain. His voice, though weathered by years of cigarettes and the harsh dust of Afghanistan, still carried a haunting quality that seemed to reach into the souls of those who paused to listen. Tonight, he had chosen to perform "The Greatest Man I Never Knew," one of Reba McEntire's most poignant ballads. The song held particular significance for James, reminding him of his own father, who had served in Vietnam and had never quite been the same after returning home. "The greatest man I never knew lived just down the hall," James sang, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "And every day we said hello, but never touched at all." Emily Parker hurried down the stairs to the platform, her messenger bag bouncing against her hip as she checked her watch. At 28, she worked as a journalist for Nashville Scene, a local magazine that covered arts, culture, and community stories. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes reflected the determination that had carried her through journalism school and into a competitive field. She had been covering a story about the city's growing homeless population when she first heard James perform 3 weeks earlier. Tonight, however, something was different. As Emily reached the platform and heard the familiar melody drifting through the underground space, she noticed that other commuters had begun to gather around James in a loose semicircle. An elderly woman clutched her purse tightly, while tears streamed down her cheeks. A young businessman in an expensive suit had loosened his tie and stood transfixed, his briefcase forgotten at his feet. James continued singing, unaware of the growing audience. His eyes were closed, lost in the memories that the song inevitably brought flooding back. He remembered his father's distant gaze, the way he would sit on the front porch for hours without speaking, the purple heart hidden away in a drawer that James had discovered only after the funeral. The parallel between his father's struggles and his own current situation was not lost on him. "He never said he loved me. Guess he thought I knew," James sang, his voice growing stronger despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "How I wish I could have told him in the living years." Emily pulled out her notebook and began scribbling observations. This wasn't just street performance. This was something deeper, more authentic than anything she had encountered in her professional career. The way James inhabited each word of the song, the genuine emotion that poured from him like water from a broken dam, created an atmosphere of raw humanity that seemed to strip away the pretenses and barriers that typically separated strangers in public spaces. Robert "Bobby" Williams descended the stairs to the platform, his silver hair neatly combed and his posture reflecting the military bearing that 62 years of life had not been able to fully erase. Bobby had served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning to build a successful construction business that he had recently sold, allowing him a comfortable retirement. Despite his financial security, Bobby carried his own invisible wounds from his service, and he had developed a keen eye for recognizing fellow veterans who were struggling. As Bobby reached the platform and heard James performing, he immediately recognized the telltale signs, the way James held himself despite his missing limb. the discipline evident in his positioning and preparation, and most importantly, the hollow look in his eyes that Bobby knew all too well. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and was trying to find their way back to a world that seemed to have moved on without them. The train's distant rumble began to echo through the tunnel, but none of the gathered commuters moved toward the edge of the platform. James opened his eyes as he finished the song, surprised to find nearly 20 people standing quietly around him. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before spontaneous applause erupted, accompanied by the distinct sound of coins and bills being dropped into his guitar case. "Thank you," James said quietly, his voice barely audible over the approaching train. "That song, it means a lot to me." Emily stepped forward, her journalist's instincts warring with her human compassion. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I'm Emily Parker from Nashville Scene magazine. I've been listening to you perform for a few weeks now, and I was wondering if you might be interested in sharing your story." James looked up at her, his weathered face creased with suspicion and fatigue. "I'm not looking for charity, miss. Just trying to make an honest living." "It's not about charity," Emily replied, crouching down to meet his eye level. "It's about telling stories that matter. Your voice, your music, it's affecting people in ways I don't think you realize." Bobby had been listening to their exchange, and he stepped forward slowly. "Son, I couldn't help but notice," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "Which unit did you serve with?" James's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Bobby's with sudden recognition. It was an unspoken language between veterans, the ability to identify one another across decades and conflicts. 101st Airborne, James replied. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Bobby nodded slowly. 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry, Vietnam, 68 to 70. He extended his hand. Bobby Williams. James Richardson. The handshake was firm, carrying the weight of shared understanding. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a rush of displaced air. Most of the commuters who had been listening to James's performance reluctantly moved toward the train doors, but several paused to drop additional money into his guitar case. Emily lingered, pulling out her business card. "I'd really like to talk with you more," she said, handing James the card. "Maybe tomorrow evening? Same time?" James studied the card for a moment before tucking it into his shirt pocket. "I'll think about it." As Emily boarded the train, she turned back to see Bobby still standing with James. The two men engaged in quiet conversation. Through the train window, she watched Bobby pull out his wallet and place several bills in James's guitar case. But more importantly, she saw him write something on a piece of paper and hand it to James. It wasn't charity. It was connection. The beginning of something that Emily sensed could become a much larger story. Bobby's paper contained his phone number and a simple message. "Coffee tomorrow, 0800 hours. Hermitage Cafe on 6th. My treat. We need to talk." As the train pulled away from the station, James sat alone on the platform, Bobby having caught the next train in the opposite direction. The evening's take had been unusually good. Enough for a decent meal and maybe even a night in the budget motel instead of the homeless shelter. But more than the money, James felt something he hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that he wasn't as alone as he had believed. He carefully packed his guitar into its battered case, folded his stool, and made his way toward the stairs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since returning from his final deployment, James Richardson felt a flicker of hope that his story might not be over yet. The platform returned to its usual emptiness, but the echo of music and the memory of an unexpected human connection lingered in the underground space, waiting for tomorrow's performance to bring new possibilities. The Hermitage Cafe buzzed with the familiar morning energy of Nashville's working class. Construction workers grabbing quick breakfasts before job sites, nurses finishing night shifts, and early-rising musicians fueling up for day jobs that paid the bills while they pursued their dreams. The vintage diner, with its red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floor, had been a Music City institution since 1951, serving unpretentious comfort food to generations of dreamers and strugglers. James Richardson arrived 15 minutes early, his guitar case slung over his shoulder and his prosthetic leg adjusted to its most comfortable setting for extended sitting. He had spent the previous evening in the budget motel, the first real bed he had slept in for over a week, thanks to the generosity of the metro station audience. The hot shower had been a luxury he hadn't realized he'd missed so desperately. Bobby Williams was already seated in a corner booth, 2 cups of coffee steaming on the table, and a newspaper folded beside his plate. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, but his posture and the way his eyes automatically scanned the room upon James's entrance revealed his military background. Bobby stood as James approached, extending his hand in greeting. "Right on time," Bobby said with approval. "Coffee's fresh. I took the liberty of ordering you the breakfast special. Figured you could use a good meal." James slid into the booth opposite Bobby, setting his guitar case beside him. "You didn't have to do that. I can pay my own way." "I know you can," Bobby replied simply. "But sometimes accepting help isn't about charity. It's about letting someone else have the honor of serving alongside you in a different kind of battle." The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Dolores with kind eyes and efficient movements, appeared with plates of eggs, bacon, hash browns, and biscuits. "Y'all need anything else, just holler," she said with a warm smile before moving on to the next table. James ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Bobby sipped his coffee and waited patiently. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the practiced quiet of 2 men who understood that some conversations couldn't be rushed. "Tell me about Afghanistan," Bobby finally said, his voice low and respectful. James set down his fork and studied Bobby's face for a long moment. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you're willing to share. Sometimes talking to someone who's been there, even if it wasn't the same there, can help." Over the next hour, James found himself sharing details he hadn't spoken aloud since his debriefing sessions at Walter Reed Medical Center. He described the impossible beauty of the Afghan mountains at sunrise, the way the ancient landscape could shift from breathtaking to deadly in an instant. He talked about his squad, young men and women who had become closer than family in the crucible of combat, and the improvised explosive device that had claimed his leg and 2 of his closest friends. Bobby listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that demonstrated his understanding of military life and the invisible wounds that often proved more challenging than physical injuries. He shared his own experiences in Vietnam, the way the jungle could swallow sound and hope with equal efficiency, the difficulty of returning to a country that seemed to have moved on without its soldiers. "The hardest part," James said, stirring his coffee absently, "wasn't losing the leg. It was losing the sense that I mattered, that I had a purpose. In the service, every day had meaning, even the terrible ones. Coming back, especially after Linda left." He trailed off, unwilling to delve into the painful details of his divorce. "Your wife couldn't handle the adjustment?" Bobby asked quietly. "She tried," James replied, his voice heavy with regret. "But I wasn't the same man she married. The nightmares, the anger, the way I'd shut down when things got overwhelming. She stuck it out for 2 years after I got back, but eventually she just couldn't do it anymore. Can't say I blame her." Bobby nodded slowly. "My first marriage didn't survive Vietnam either. Took me another 10 years and a lot of therapy before I was ready to try again. Been married to Margaret for 32 years now, but it wasn't easy getting there." James looked up sharply. "Therapy? You went to therapy?" "Best decision I ever made," Bobby replied without embarrassment. "Took me a while to admit I needed help, but pride doesn't keep you warm at night or stop the dreams. There's no shame in getting support for invisible wounds." Across town, Emily Parker was researching veteran support services in Nashville, preparing for her evening meeting with James. Her small apartment was cluttered with notebooks, newspaper clippings, and printed articles about homelessness, PTSD, and the challenges facing returning soldiers. As a journalist, she had covered numerous social issues. But James's story felt different, more personal, more urgent. Her phone rang, interrupting her research. "Nashville scene. This is Emily." "Emily, it's David." Her editor's voice crackled through the speaker. "How's that homeless veteran story coming along?" "It's evolving into something bigger," Emily replied, glancing at her notes. "I think we might have the makings of a feature series rather than just a single article. The human interest angle is compelling, but there are larger systemic issues at play." "Good. The board is looking for content that generates engagement. Human interest stories perform well, especially if they have a positive resolution." Emily frowned slightly. "David, I want to be careful that we're not exploiting someone's struggles for clicks. This man's story deserves to be told with dignity." "Of course," David replied quickly. "Just keep in mind that our readers respond to hope. Find the angle that shows how the community can come together to support our veterans." After ending the call, Emily returned to her research with renewed focus. She discovered that Nashville had several veteran support organizations, but many were underfunded and overwhelmed by demand. The city's rapid growth and rising cost of living had made affordable housing increasingly scarce, particularly for veterans on fixed incomes or struggling with employment due to service-related disabilities. Back at the Hermitage Cafe, Bobby was writing something on a napkin. "I want to give you a few phone numbers," he said, sliding the napkin across the table to James. "The first one is for Dr. Patricia Gonzalez. She's a therapist who specializes in working with veterans. The second is for a guy named Michael Foster, who runs a nonprofit that helps vets with job placement and housing assistance." James studied the napkin skeptically. "Bobby, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've been through the system. The VA has wait lists longer than Afghanistan deployments, and most of these nonprofits are just feel-good operations that don't actually change anything." "Maybe," Bobby conceded, "but these are different. Dr. Gonzalez is a veteran herself, served as a combat medic in Iraq. And Michael Foster? He was homeless for 3 years after coming back from Desert Storm. They understand the system because they've been where you are." Bobby leaned forward, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "James, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to really hear me. What happened to you? The injury, the struggles, the feeling like you don't matter. None of that is your fault. But staying stuck in this cycle when there are people willing to help, that's a choice. And it's one that dishonors the memory of the men who didn't make it back." The words hit James like a physical blow. He thought of Sergeant Collins and Private Martinez, the 2 soldiers who had died in the same explosion that claimed his leg. They would never have the opportunity to struggle with civilian life, to perform music in subway stations, or to sit in warm diners sharing stories with fellow veterans. "I'll think about it," James said finally, folding the napkin carefully and putting it in his wallet. Bobby signaled for the check, but before Dolores could bring it, James spoke again. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. Don't owe me anything." Bobby was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming softly against his coffee cup. "Because 35 years ago, I was sitting in a diner not unlike this one, and an old Korean War veteran bought me breakfast. and gave me some phone numbers written on a napkin. I was too proud and too angry to use them for another 6 months. But when I finally did, they saved my life. He pulled out his wallet and placed money on the table for both meals. Sometimes we're not saving the person in front of us, James. Sometimes we're saving the person we used to be, or the person we might become, if we don't pay attention to the connections that matter. As they prepared to leave, Bobby handed James one more piece of paper, this one containing an address. There's an open mic night every Thursday at the Bluebird Cafe. It's not like performing in the subway. It's real musicians, real audience, real opportunity. You've got talent, James. Real talent. Maybe it's time to think bigger than survival. James looked at the address, recognizing the name of the legendary venue that had launched countless country music careers. Bobby, places like the Bluebird don't want broken-down veterans playing for spare change. They want authentic voices telling real stories, Bobby corrected. And brother, you've got more authenticity in your pinky finger than most of these manufactured acts have in their entire careers. As they walked out of the Hermitage Cafe together, James felt the weight of possibilities pressing against the familiar burden of despair. The morning sun was warm on his face, and for the first time in months, he began to consider that maybe his story wasn't ending. Maybe it was just finding a new chapter. That evening, as James prepared for another performance in the metro station, he found himself thinking about the napkin in his wallet and the address of the Bluebird Cafe. Emily Parker would be there soon, wanting to hear his story, and he was beginning to realize that he might finally be ready to tell it. The metro station seemed different that evening as James settled into his usual spot. The fluorescent lights still flickered with their familiar inconsistency, and the concrete platform retained its perpetual chill. But something in James's posture had shifted. Bobby Williams's words from that morning echoed in his mind as he tuned his guitar, and the folded napkin in his wallet felt like it carried more weight than the few dollar bills surrounding it. Emily Parker arrived precisely on time. Her messenger bag containing a digital recorder and a notebook filled with preliminary questions. She had spent the afternoon researching James's military unit and learning about the specific challenges faced by veterans of the Afghanistan conflict. Her approach to journalism had always been thorough, but this story felt more personal than anything she had previously covered. "Mr. Richardson," Emily called softly as she approached his performance area, "thank you for agreeing to talk with me." James looked up from his guitar, noting the respectful distance Emily maintained and the genuine warmth in her green eyes. "Call me James, and I want to be clear about something up front. I'm not looking for pity, and I'm not interested in being anyone's inspiration porn." Emily blinked, momentarily taken aback by his directness. "I understand. That's not what I'm after either. I'm interested in telling your story honestly, whatever that story is." "Fair enough." James gestured to a nearby bench. "But I keep playing while we talk. This is how I make my living." Emily settled onto the bench and pulled out her recorder, placing it on the ground between them where it could capture both voices clearly. "Tell me about the music. When did you start playing?" James began with a soft instrumental piece, his fingers moving automatically across the familiar chord progressions while he spoke. "My dad taught me when I was 12. He'd been a musician before Vietnam. Had dreams of making it in Nashville, actually. War changed those plans, but he never stopped loving music. Said it was one of the few things that could reach the parts of him that the war had damaged." As James spoke, early commuters began to filter onto the platform. Emily noticed how naturally they gravitated toward his performance area, even those who were clearly in a hurry seeming to slow their pace as they passed. There was something magnetic about James's presence. Not just his voice, but the authenticity that radiated from him like heat from a fire. After Dad died, I put the guitar away for years, James continued, transitioning into a gentle version of Angel from Montgomery, John Prine's classic that resonated deeply with working-class audiences. Picked it up again during my first deployment. Guys in the unit would gather around when I played, and for a little while we could forget where we were. Emily scribbled notes while listening, trying to capture not just James's words, but the way his entire demeanor shifted when he performed. The guarded defensiveness that characterized his speaking voice melted away when he sang, replaced by something vulnerable and powerful. "What happened after you came home?" Emily asked gently. James's fingers hesitated on the strings for just a moment before continuing. The usual story. Physical therapy, disability processing, trying to figure out how to be a civilian again. Linda, my ex-wife, she tried to be patient, but I wasn't the man she married anymore. Couldn't hold down steady work, couldn't handle crowds or loud noises, couldn't sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. The platform began to fill with the evening rush hour crowd, but instead of the usual anonymous bustle, people seemed to be lingering. A group of young professionals had gathered near the far wall, listening openly. An elderly couple sat on a bench across the platform, the woman dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "The divorce was finalized 8 months ago," James continued, his voice steady, but his eyes focused on his guitar strings. "Lost the apartment. Lost most of my possessions. Benefits weren't enough to cover rent anywhere decent, and my credit was shot from the medical bills. Ended up in the shelter system. But those places," he shook his head, "they're not designed for people dealing with PTSD. Too crowded, too chaotic, too many triggers." Emily noticed a familiar figure descending the stairs to the platform. Bobby Williams moved through the crowd with purpose, but instead of approaching James directly, he positioned himself near the edge of the gathering audience. Emily watched as Bobby began dropping bills into James's guitar case. But more importantly, she observed how he encouraged others to do the same through subtle gestures and his own obvious appreciation for the performance. "So the subway became your venue," Emily observed. "Better than the streets," James replied, beginning the opening chords to "The Greatest Man I Never Knew." "Down here, people are transitioning between places, between moods. They're more open to hearing something real." As James sang Reba McEntire's poignant ballad, Emily noticed something remarkable happening around them. Conversations ceased, phone calls were ended, and the usual urban anonymity dissolved into something approaching communion. A businessman in an expensive suit stood perfectly still, tears streaming down his face. A young mother held her toddler close, swaying gently to the music. Even the metro security guard had paused his rounds to listen. "The greatest man I never knew came home to me each night," James sang, his voice carrying a weight of personal experience that transformed the familiar lyrics into something achingly immediate. "But I was always somewhere else, and never got it right." Emily realized she was witnessing something far more significant than street performance. This was therapy, both for James and for his accidental audience. In a city built on musical dreams and commercial success, James was offering something increasingly rare: unfiltered human truth expressed through art. When the song ended, the silence stretched for several heartbeats before applause erupted spontaneously. Bills and coins filled James's guitar case. But more importantly, several audience members approached to speak with him directly. Emily watched, fascinated, as brief but meaningful conversations took place. A veteran from the Gulf War sharing a moment of recognition. A young woman mentioning that the song reminded her of her grandfather. An older man quietly thanking James for his service. Bobby finally approached, greeting Emily with a nod before addressing James. "Son, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." He pulled out his phone and showed James a text message. "Dr. Gonzalez can see you tomorrow afternoon if you're interested." No commitment, just a conversation. James studied the message, his internal conflict visible in his expression. "Bobby, I appreciate everything you're trying to do, but therapy costs money I don't have." "Already taken care of," Bobby replied simply. "Consider it an investment in a fellow soldier's future." Emily looked between the two men, recognizing the significance of the moment. "James, would you be willing to let me document some of this process? Not intrusively, but as part of the larger story about how veterans support each other and find their way back into the community?" James was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently picking out a simple melody. Around them, the metro platform had returned to its usual rhythm, but the energy in the space felt different, charged with possibility and human connection. "There's something else," Bobby said, pulling out the slip of paper with the Bluebird Cafe's address. "Tomorrow night is Thursday, open mic night. I know it seems like a big leap, but James, what you do down here is special. People need to hear it in a setting where it can reach a wider audience." James took the paper, studying the address as if it contained some complex equation. "The Bluebird Cafe isn't a charity case venue, Bobby. They showcase real artists." "You are a real artist," Emily interjected, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I've been covering music in this city for 3 years, and what I just witnessed was more authentic and moving than anything I've seen on the main stages downtown." The 6:47 train pulled into the station, and Emily reluctantly prepared to leave. As she gathered her equipment, she handed James her business card again, this time with her personal cell phone number written on the back. "I'd like to be there tomorrow night," she said. "At the Bluebird. Not as a journalist, but as someone who believes in what you're doing." As Emily boarded the train, she turned back to see James and Bobby in deep conversation, the older veteran's hand resting supportively on James's shoulder. Through the train window, she watched until they disappeared from view, knowing that she had just witnessed the beginning of something transformative. That night, alone in her apartment, Emily reviewed her recordings and notes from the evening. She realized that James's story wasn't just about one veteran's struggle. It was about the power of human connection to heal invisible wounds, the role of art in processing trauma, and the way community support could literally save lives. More than that, she sensed that James Richardson was on the verge of a breakthrough that would extend far beyond his personal healing. His authentic voice and powerful presence suggested the possibility of something much larger, perhaps even the kind of career that his father had dreamed of before Vietnam changed everything. As Emily began drafting her article, she found herself writing not just about James's current circumstances, but about the potential she had witnessed in that underground performance space. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight she was certain that she was documenting the early stages of something remarkable. Thursday evening arrived with an unexpected spring shower that sent Nashville residents scurrying for cover under awnings and into doorways along Music Row. The Bluebird Cafe, nestled in the upscale Green Hills neighborhood, glowed warmly through its windows as early dinner guests and open mic hopefuls began to gather. The legendary venue, with its intimate seating arrangement and acoustic focus, had launched more country music careers than any other single location in Nashville. James Richardson stood across the street from the Bluebird, his guitar case protected from the rain by a plastic garbage bag Bobby Williams had insisted he take. The contrast between this polished establishment and the gritty metro station where he usually performed felt overwhelming. Through the restaurant's windows, he could see well-dressed patrons enjoying expensive meals, while musicians set up equipment on the small stage. "Second thoughts?" Bobby asked, appearing beside James with 2 cups of coffee from a nearby convenience store. Third and fourth thoughts, James admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. Bobby, look at this place. These people are here for entertainment, not to hear some broken-down veteran work through his issues in public. Sati Federer. Emily Parker approached from the parking lot, having arrived early to secure seats near the stage. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, dressed down from her usual professional attire, but still looking polished compared to James's worn clothing and military surplus jacket. The sign-up sheet is getting full, Emily reported, joining the two men under the awning of a nearby shop. But I talked to the sound engineer, and he said they always save slots for walk-ins. Especially veterans, she added, glancing meaningfully at Bobby. Bobby smiled slightly. I may have made a phone call earlier. The Bluebird has a long tradition of supporting military musicians. James studied his companions, recognizing the careful orchestration of support they had arranged. You two planned this. We facilitated, Emily corrected. The choice is still entirely yours. Inside the Bluebird Cafe, the atmosphere buzzed with the familiar energy of Nashville's music scene. Aspiring songwriters clutched guitars and notebooks, seasoned session musicians chatted with industry professionals, and tourists from across the country hoped to witness the discovery of the next big star. The venue's walls were lined with photographs of legendary performers who had graced its stage, from Garth Brooks to Taylor Swift. Dr. Patricia Gonzalez sat at a corner table, sipping herbal tea and reviewing notes from her afternoon session with James. The therapy appointment had been emotionally challenging but productive, with James finally beginning to articulate the complex guilt and grief he carried from his military service. Patricia, a veteran herself who had transitioned from combat medicine to psychology, recognized the signs of breakthrough in James's willingness to consider public performance as a form of healing. The therapeutic value of artistic expression for trauma recovery is well documented, Patricia had explained to James earlier that day. But more than that, sharing your story through music can help other veterans feel less alone in their struggles. At 7:30 p.m., James finally crossed the street and entered the Bluebird Cafe, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and terror. The warmth and intimacy of the space felt both welcoming and intimidating. Bobby had reserved a table near the stage, and Emily was already seated with her notebook discreetly tucked away. The host, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, approached James as he hesitated near the entrance. "You must be James Richardson," Bobby Williams called ahead. "I'm Susan, and I want you to know that we're honored to have you perform tonight." James followed Susan to the sign-up area, where a cheerful young man with multiple tattoos and a vintage acoustic guitar greeted him warmly. "Hey, I'm Jake Mitchell, tonight's MC. Bobby told me a little about your story. We've got you scheduled for the second set, right after the dinner crowd settles in. That's prime time. The audience will be warmed up, but still attentive." As James settled at Bobby and Emily's table, he noticed several other veterans scattered throughout the audience. Word had somehow spread through Nashville's veteran community, and a dozen former servicemen and women had quietly arranged to attend. Bobby's networking had been more extensive than he had initially revealed. The first set featured a mix of singer-songwriters, from nervous newcomers performing original compositions to more experienced musicians working out new material. James listened intently, noting the way successful performers connected with the audience through eye contact, storytelling, and emotional vulnerability. The Bluebirds' audience was sophisticated but appreciative, offering respectful attention even to less polished acts. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake Mitchell announced as the second set began, "our next performer is James Richardson, a veteran of the 101st Airborne, who has been sharing his music with Nashville's metro commuters. Tonight, he's bringing that same authentic voice to our stage." James walked to the small performance area his prosthetic leg feeling more stable than usual thanks to the afternoon adjustment session Dr. Gonzalez had recommended. The stage lights were warm, but not harsh, and the audience's attention felt supportive rather than judgmental. "Good evening," James said into the microphone, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I want to thank the Bluebird for this opportunity, and I want to dedicate this first song to my father, who dreamed of playing on this stage, but never got the chance." James began with an instrumental introduction to "The Greatest Man I Never Knew," his fingers finding the familiar chord progressions that had carried him through countless Metro performances. But something was different in this setting. The acoustics of the room allowed for subtler dynamics, and the attentive silence of the audience created space for deeper emotional expression. "The greatest man I never knew lived just down the hall," James sang, his voice carrying new layers of meaning as he thought about his father, his fallen comrades, and his own journey toward healing. "And every day we said hello, but never touched at all." The audience was completely still, drawn into the emotional landscape James was creating through his performance. At the corner table, Dr. Gonzalez observed the transformation taking place. James's posture had straightened, his voice had found new power, and the hypervigilant tension that characterized his daily demeanor had softened into focused presence. As James moved through the song's verses, he began to see individual faces in the audience. The elderly veteran near the bar, whose eyes reflected recognition and pain. The young couple holding hands as they listened to lyrics about missed connections and unspoken love. The industry professional in the back corner who had put down his phone to give James his complete attention. "How I wish I could have told him in the living years," James concluded, the final note hanging in the air like a prayer. The silence that followed was profound, broken finally by applause that began softly and built to a sustained ovation. Several audience members were openly crying, and James noticed that Bobby was standing, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," James said simply, then launched into his second song, an original composition he had been working on during his Metro performances. A piece about coming home from war and finding that home had changed in ways both subtle and profound. "I came back from a desert war with sand still in my boots, but the ground beneath my hometown felt like quicksand to my roots. The flag still flies on Main Street, and the church bells still ring true, but the man who went to fight that war ain't the man who's singing to you." This song was rawer, more personal, and James felt the vulnerability of sharing something he had never performed publicly. But the audience remained with him, their attention creating a safe space for artistic risk-taking. Emily scribbled notes frantically, recognizing that she was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a veteran finding his voice. This was the birth of an artist who could speak for an entire generation of warriors struggling to find their place in civilian society. As James finished his second song, Jake Mitchell returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, James Richardson. Let's show our appreciation for sharing his music and his story with us tonight." The applause was thunderous, but more importantly, it was sustained. People began standing, and soon the entire room was on its feet. James stood behind the microphone, overwhelmed by the response and the feeling of connection he had never experienced in his Metro performances. As the applause finally died down, a familiar voice called out from the back of the room, "That was beautiful, honey. Absolutely beautiful." James looked up, squinting against the stage lights, and felt his heart stop. Standing near the entrance, still wearing a light rain jacket and surrounded by what appeared to be a small entourage, was Reba McEntire herself. The room fell into stunned silence as the country music legend began walking toward the stage, her famous red hair catching the light and her warm smile focused entirely on James. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "But I was driving by when my assistant told me about tonight's performance. I had to stop in." James stood frozen, his guitar hanging slack in his hands as one of his musical heroes approached the stage. Around the room, phones began appearing as audience members realized they were witnessing an unprecedented moment in Bluebird Cafe history. "Young man," Reba said, now close enough that James could see the genuine emotion in her eyes, "that was one of the most powerful performances of my song I've ever heard. And your original piece, that needs to be recorded. Tonight." The legendary performer turned to address the entire room, her voice taking on the commanding presence that had made her one of country music's most beloved figures. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just witnessed something special. This is what music is supposed to do: tell truth, heal hearts, and bring people together." James felt tears streaming down his face as Reba extended her hand to him. "Would you do me the honor of singing my song with me? I think these folks would like to hear it one more time." As James nodded, unable to speak, the room erupted in applause once again. But this time, he wasn't just a struggling veteran sharing his pain in a subway tunnel. He was an artist, recognized by one of the greatest performers in country music history, standing on the stage where dreams came true. The moment felt surreal, but it was also the culmination of every small act of courage that had brought him to this point. Accepting Bobby's friendship, trusting Emily with his story, and most importantly, believing that his voice mattered enough to be heard. 6 months later, the Nashville music scene was still buzzing about what had become known as the Bluebird moment. Videos of James Richardson's performance with Reba McEntire had gone viral, generating millions of views and transforming an underground metro musician into an overnight sensation. But for James himself, the real transformation had been quieter and more profound than the public attention suggested. The recording studio in Music Row hummed with activity as James put the finishing touches on his debut album, Coming Home. The project, funded by a major label that had signed him within days of the Bluebird performance, featured both traditional country covers and original compositions that drew directly from his experiences as a veteran adjusting to civilian life. Emily Parker sat in the control room, watching James work with his producer and a full band of Nashville's finest session musicians. Her article series about James's journey had won a regional journalism award and had been picked up by national publications. But more importantly, it had sparked conversations about veteran support services across the country. The Nashville scene had promoted her to senior writer, and she was now working on a book about music as therapy for trauma survivors. "Take it from the bridge one more time," the producer called through the intercom. "James, remember what we talked about. Let the emotion guide the vocal. Don't force it." James nodded, adjusting his headphones and preparing to record another pass of Letters Never Sent, a haunting ballad about the things soldiers wished they could tell their families, but never found the words to express. The song had been inspired by his therapy sessions with Dr. Gonzalez, who continued to work with James on processing his military experiences and adapting to his rapidly changing circumstances. Through the studio's large windows, James could see Bobby Williams sitting in the waiting area, reading a newspaper and sipping coffee. Bobby had become not just a mentor, but a true friend, helping James navigate the complexities of sudden fame while staying grounded in the values that made his music authentic. The construction business owner had also established a nonprofit organization dedicated to connecting veteran musicians with performance opportunities and mental health resources. As James sang the bridge of Letters Never Sent, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, and the strength that came from surviving his darkest moments. If I could write the letters that I never had the chance to send, I'd tell you that the boy who left ain't the man who's coming back again. But somewhere in the space between the war and coming home, I found a voice that speaks for all the hearts that fight alone. The recording session concluded successfully, and James emerged from the vocal booth to find Reba McEntire herself waiting in the control room. The country music legend had become an unexpected mentor and advocate, using her influence to ensure that James's story reached the widest possible audience while protecting him from the more exploitative aspects of the music industry. "That was perfect, honey," Reba said, embracing James warmly. "That song is going to touch a lot of people who need to hear it." "I still can't believe this is all real," James admitted, settling into a chair beside Emily and Bobby. "6 months ago, I was sleeping in shelters and wondering if I'd ever matter to anyone again." "You always mattered," Dr. Gonzalez interjected, entering the control room with a warm smile. "You just needed to remember that yourself and find the right people to help you along the way." The group moved to a nearby restaurant for dinner, a tradition they had developed during the intense months of recording and promotion. The Nashville establishment, accustomed to celebrity diners, provided a private room where they could talk freely about the remarkable journey they had shared. "The album is testing incredibly well with focus groups," James's manager reported, joining them at the table. "Radio stations are already requesting advance copies, and the pre-orders are exceeding everyone's expectations." But James was more interested in different metrics of success. What about the veteran response? Are we reaching the people who actually need to hear these songs? Emily pulled out her laptop, opening a folder of emails that had been flooding in since news of James's story had spread. "Listen to this one," she said, selecting a message at random. "Dear Mr. Richardson, I'm a Marine veteran who's been struggling with PTSD for 8 years. I heard your interview on the radio, and, for the first time since coming home, I felt like someone understood what I was going through. I called the VA crisis line that night, and I'm starting therapy next week. Thank you for showing me that healing is possible." Similar letters arrived daily, from veterans, military families, and civilians who had been touched by James's story and music. The impact extended far beyond entertainment. It was literally saving lives and encouraging people to seek help for invisible wounds. Reba raised her glass in a toast to James Richardson, who reminded us that the most powerful music comes from the most authentic places, and to all of you who helped make this journey possible. As they clinked glasses, James reflected on the interconnected series of events that had brought him to this moment. If Bobby hadn't recognized a fellow veteran in the metro station, if Emily hadn't been willing to listen to his story with genuine respect, if Dr. Gonzalez hadn't provided the therapeutic support he needed to process his trauma, any missing link in that chain of human connection could have left him trapped in the underground tunnels of despair. After dinner, the group walked through downtown Nashville, past the neon lights of honky-tonk bars and the bustling crowds of tourists seeking authentic country music experiences. They paused outside the Bridgestone Arena, where James would be opening for Reba in 2 weeks as part of her national tour. "Nervous about the arena shows?" Bobby asked, noting James's contemplative expression as he studied the massive venue. "Terrified," James admitted honestly, "but also excited. Every night, there will be veterans in those audiences, people who feel forgotten or broken or alone. If my story can help even one person realize that they're not alone, that healing is possible, then it's worth the fear." Emily was documenting this conversation in her notebook when her phone buzzed with an urgent message from her editor. "James, you need to see this," she said, pulling up a video on her phone's screen. The video showed a metro station, not in Nashville but in Philadelphia. A young veteran was performing acoustic versions of James's songs, his own guitar case open for donations. But more remarkable was the crowd that had gathered. Other veterans, civilians, families with children, all listening intently as the performer shared his own story between songs. "It's happening in cities across the country," Emily explained, scrolling through similar videos from Chicago, Atlanta, Denver, and Seattle. "Veterans are using your music as a way to connect with their communities, to find their own voices, to start their own healing journeys." James watched the videos with wonder, realizing that his personal journey had become something much larger than he had ever imagined. His music was creating a movement, inspiring other veterans to step out of isolation and into community connection. As the evening wound down, James found himself standing alone outside the metro station, where his transformation had begun. The platform looked the same. Fluorescent lights still flickered. Concrete walls still echoed with the sound of arriving trains. Commuters still hurried past with determined anonymity. But for James, the space held completely different meaning now. This wasn't a place of desperation and survival. It was the birthplace of hope, the location where strangers had chosen to see him as a human being worthy of dignity and support. Emily approached, having followed him down to the platform. "Thinking about the old days?" "Thinking about how many people are still down here," James replied, gesturing to the empty performance spot where he had once sat with his guitar case open for coins. "People who feel invisible, who think their stories don't matter, who can't imagine that tomorrow could be different from today." "Your foundation will help change that," Emily reminded him. The James Richardson Foundation, established with proceeds from his music sales, was already funding veteran support programs and music therapy initiatives across the country. "I hope so," James said quietly. "But more than the foundation, more than the money or the programs, I hope my story helps people understand that healing is possible, that community matters, that every voice has value." A train approached in the distance, its headlight cutting through the tunnel darkness like a metaphor for hope emerging from despair. As it pulled into the station, James and Emily boarded together, heading back to the surface, where James's new life awaited. On the ride up, James thought about the letter he had received that morning from a veteran in Oregon who had been inspired to start performing music therapy sessions at his local VA hospital. The veteran had written, "You showed me that our scars don't have to be the end of our stories. They can be the beginning of our healing, and our healing can become a gift we give to others." As the train emerged into the Nashville night, James Richardson, veteran, survivor, artist, and healer, looked ahead to a future filled with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. His journey from the depths of despair to the heights of artistic success had been made possible by the simple but profound recognition that no one heals alone. That community connection could literally save lives, and that authentic voices telling true stories could change the world one heart at a time. The greatest man he never knew had been himself, the person he was capable of becoming when surrounded by people who believed in his worth, supported his healing, and amplified his voice until it could reach everyone who needed to hear it. In the end, James's story became proof that sometimes the most broken places can become the most powerful stages, and the most wounded voices can sing the most healing songs.